The driver heard the shot before he felt the silence, close enough to taste the powder. Close enough to know Harlem would never hear footsteps the same again. The shot didn't echo the way gunshots usually do. It landed heavy, final, like the Badi. Room decided to hold its breath afterward. Bumpy Johnson was seated in the back, coat buttoned, posture calm. The driver's hands were still on the wheel when the sound cut through the glass and metal. Too close. Close enough to blur intention. And consequence. Point blank. The driver didn't scream. He didn't turn around. He knew better than to look first. In Harlem, you listened before you reacted. Especially when Bumpy Johnson was behind you. Outside, someone ran. Shoes slapped pavement, fast and panicked. That told the real story. Whoever fired the shot hadn't planned to stay long enough to explain himself. Bumpy didn't move. No sudden reach. No shouted order. Just stillness. The kind that makes other men realize they've already said too much. The driver felt his pulse in his throat. He smelled burned powder and cold air slipping through an open door somewhere. His mind raced ahead, cataloging outcomes. Retaliation, confusion, sirens. The old rhythm of violence that always wanted to repeat itself. But behind him, nothing happened. Bumpy Johnson looked out the window, eyes steady, as if the street itself had spoken to him. As if the gunshot were a question, not a threat. People nearby froze where they stood. A man halfway into a store didn't finish stepping inside. A woman across the street tightened her grip on a paper bag until it tore. Number one shouted. No one pointed. They were waiting to see what kind of moment this would become. The driver finally spoke, voice low, careful not to crack the air again. You all right, Mr. Johnson? Bumpy didn't answer right away. Silence stretched, deliberate. He adjusted his cuff, straightened his coat. A man who understood that panic was louder than bullets. I'm fine, he said at last, calm, almost bored. Then, softer, drive. The engine turned over. The car rolled forward like nothing had happened, like the streets hadn't just been challenged. That was the part that unsettled everyone. A shot fired that close was supposed to demand blood. That's how insults were usually answered, loudly, publicly, with interest. But Bumpy Johnson didn't trade in reflexes. He traded in memory. As the car moved, heads turned. Not to chase the shooter, to watch Bumpy leave, to read the language of his silence. Harlem understood pauses better than speeches. The driver kept his eyes on the road, but he could feel it. The weight of something beginning. Not chaos. Not revenge. Something slower. Something that would last. The sound of the shot stayed behind. Them, hanging in the street like a question nobody else was allowed to answer. Not yet. The car didn't speed away. That mattered. It moved at the same pace it always did, rolling through Harlem like it belonged to the street, like it had nothing to apologize for. Windows open, engine steady, no panic bleeding through the tires. People noticed. They always did. When Bumpy Johnson passed. Not because he demanded attention, because he carried gravity. The kind that made conversations lower themselves automatically. A man sweeping his stoop stopped mid-stroke. Didn't look surprised, just thoughtful. He leaned on the broom and watched the car go by like he was counting something that couldn't be written down. The driver could feel eyes tracking them from both sides now. Not hostile, not curious. Protective. This was their block. Their quiet agreement. Bumpy wasn't just passing through Harlem. He was being observed by people who measured safety in moments like this. No sirens yet. That mattered too. A shopkeeper stepped halfway outside his store, then decided against it. Pulled the door closed gently, like noise itself could be disrespectful. Inside, radios turned down. Dice games paused without complaint. The driver swallowed. His knuckles were white. No, but he kept the wheel straight. He'd driven for men before. Men who needed gunfire to announce themselves. Bumpy Johnson didn't dot in the back seat. Bumpy watched faces instead of corners. He wasn't hunting. He was reading. Every face told him something different. Fear, loyalty, calculation, relief. Most of all, patience. The street hadn't erupted because it didn't need to. Harlem knew violence when it saw it. It also knew when not to offer it encouragement. Someone had fired that shot to provoke a response, to force a public reaction, to turn Bumpy into noise. Harlem refused. That refusal was louder than any gun. Driver finally noticed something else. People weren't scattering. They weren't running inside or ducking into doorways. They were staying put. A kid on the corner leaned against a lamppost, eyes following the car like he was memorizing a lesson. An older woman nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as Bumpy passed. No smile, just acknowledgement. Bumpy gave nothing back. Not a wave, not a glance of reassurance. Respect didn't need theater. It lived in consistency. At the next intersection, a man crossed the street deliberately in front of them, slow enough to be rude if it weren't so intentional. He made eye contact with the driver, then glanced toward the back seat. A check-in. The driver eased off the gas just enough. The man nodded and kept walking. No words exchanged. No signal beyond that. Harlem had its own communication system. Always had. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, just enough for his presence to be felt without being announced. "They saw," he said. Quietly. The driver nodded. "Yes, sir." That was all that needed saying. The shot wasn't a secret anymore. But it wasn't a story either. Not yet. Stories required interpretation. Harlem wasn't ready to interpret. It was waiting to see who would speak next, and whether they would be smart enough to stay quiet. The car turned another corner. Life resumed its shape behind them, but the air felt denser, like the streets themselves were holding on to the moment. The driver realized then, this wasn't about survival. This was about ownership. Someone had fired a gun to test the balance. Harlem had answered by not moving, and that answer belonged to Bumpy Johnson. Pressure doesn't announce itself. It seeps. By the time the car disappeared from the block, phones were already ringing in places the driver would never see. Back rooms, upstairs offices, apartments where men sat too still, staring at walls like they might answer back. Nobody claimed the shot. That was the first message. The second came quieter. A meeting that usually happened on schedule was suddenly postponed. A delivery arrived late without explanation. A favor that had been dependable for years stalled just long enough to be noticed. Nothing loud. Nothing illegal on paper. Just pressure. Bumpy Johnson felt it before anyone explained it to him. He always did. He understood that when enemies didn't strike twice, they circled instead. They wanted impatience, wanted him to reach. He didn't. He sat in his chair later that night, hands folded, listening to men talk themselves into revealing what they were afraid of. Voices filled the room, but none of them carried authority. Authority waited. When someone finally mentioned the shot, it was careful, casual, disguised as concern. "People asking questions," a man said. "Wondering how you want to handle It. Bumpy looked at him long enough to let the question exhaust itself. Questions get tired, Bumpy said. Answers don't. Silence reclaimed the room. The pressure campaign continued. A rival sent word through a third party, not a threat, not an apology. Just a reminder that things could become complicated if misunderstandings weren't cleared. Misunderstandings. Bumpy smiled at that. Not wide, not amused. The kind of smile reserved for men who thought language could protect them from intent. He didn't send an answer back. He let the messenger return empty-handed. Let uncertainty do the work. Violence usually rushed. That unsettled them more than a gun ever could. Closed doors don't keep out consequences. They only delay them. Every man applying pressure behind the scenes had to ask the same question before he slept. Why hasn't he moved yet? That question became a weight. Bumpy moved through Harlem the next day like nothing had changed. Same route, same pace, same quiet authority. Men watched for signs, anger, urgency, revenge. They saw none, and that absence forced everyone else to fill in the blanks with their worst assumptions. The pressure tightened. A public space denied. A seat left empty where it shouldn't have been. Someone laughed a little too loud at the wrong time. That was the real provocation, not the gunshot. The insult was patience tested publicly. An attempt to make restraint look like fear. Bumpy noticed. He always did. And when he finally spoke about it, it wasn't in anger. It was in principle. People forget, he said calmly, that silence ain't surrender. It's timing. The men around him understood what that meant. Pressure had been applied. Lines had been nudged. Doors had been closed. Soon, one would open, and whoever stepped through would have to live with what followed. Disrespect doesn't need volume. It just needs witnesses. The room was neutral ground. That was the excuse. A place where men pretended. Business could be separated from history. Tables polished. Glasses clean. Faces trained to look welcoming without meaning it. Bumpy Johnson walked in without pause. No entourage, no announcement. His presence alone reset the temperature. Conversations dipped. Not stopped, dipped. Enough to show awareness without submission. That was intentional. Someone wanted him to feel the edge of it. He took his seat. Across the room, a chair remained empty longer than it should have. A delay measured in seconds, but designed to be noticed. When the man finally arrived, he didn't apologize. He smiled. That smile was the insult. Not wide. Not mocking. Controlled. The kind men practiced in mirrors when they wanted to seem unafraid. He sat without acknowledging Bumpy directly, addressing the room instead. Business talk followed. Numbers, logistics, safe words. All of it deliberately. Ordinary. Bumpy listened, eyes steady, expression unreadable. He let the performance run. Then the man finally turned toward him. Hope everything's been quiet, he said. The word hung there. Quiet. Everyone heard it. Everyone understood what it referenced. The shot. The silence after. The question of whether restraint meant loss of control. This was the test. Bumpy didn't react. He didn't correct him. Didn't bristle. He took a sip from his glass, unhurried, then set it down carefully. The sound of glass on wood landed, heavier than the insult. Quiet's good, Bumpy said. Means nobody's confused. A few men shifted in their seats. The man's smile began, smaller this time. He pressed on, mistaking calm for retreat. Some folks might take it the wrong way, he said. Silence can make people wonder. Bumpy leaned back, just slightly. He met the man's eyes now, not challenging, not threatening, Informative. Only. People who wonder, Bumpy said, are the ones hoping I'm unsure. The room went still. That was enough. No shouting followed. No dramatic exit. The meeting continued, but the damage was done. The disrespect had been delivered publicly. The line crossed where witnesses could carry it forward. Bumpy rose before anyone else. He nodded once to the room. Not permission, not gratitude, recognition. As he walked out, conversations didn't resume right away. Men stared into their drinks, recalculating. The man who'd smiled first didn't look up at all. Outside, Harlem waited. This time, it wasn't patient. Word traveled. Not embellished, not exaggerated, just accurate enough to be dangerous. Bumpy Johnson had been tested. He hadn't moved. Yet. That was worse, because everyone knew what came next. Wouldn't be loud. It would be precise, and it would teach something. The response didn't come that night, or the next morning. That was the first lesson. Men who expected retaliation waited for raised voices, sudden moves, visible anger. None arrived. Harlem stayed intact. Roots stayed open. Money kept moving. The city breathed like it always had. That unsettled them. Bumpy Johnson understood something most men didn't. Dominance wasn't proven by speed. It was proven by control of timing. When you moved too fast, you showed where it hurt. He chose not to show anything. Instead, a message went out quietly. Not a threat, not a demand. An invitation. One-on-one. No audience. No witnesses to impress. The man who had smiled in that room accepted. He had to. Declining would have been its own kind of confession. They met in a place that didn't belong to either of them. Neutral walls, neutral lighting, no weapons visible, though everyone knew where they were hidden. Bumpy arrived first. He stood, not to intimidate, but to remove excuses. When the other man entered, Bumpy nodded once and sat back down, calm, centered. No opening remarks. Silence did the talking. The man cleared his throat, started to speak, stopped himself, tried again. I didn't mean anything by. Bumpy raised a hand, not sharp, not abrupt, gentle. That's the problem, he said evenly. You meant it for everybody else. The words landed clean, no anger in them, just truth. The man shifted. The smile was gone now, replaced by something closer to understanding or fear. It was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. I heard a shot was fired, the man said carefully. People thought what they wanted, Bumpy replied. You decided to help them think it. Silence returned. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. Not invading space, claiming it. I didn't answer that shot, he continued, because answering it would have been easy, expected, messy. He paused. Let the implication breathe. What you did, he said, was harder to forgive. You tried to make my restraint look like doubt. The man swallowed. I won't do it again, he said. Bumpy studied him long enough to make sure the promise wasn't reflex. I know, Bumpy said, because next time wouldn't be about me. That was it. No threats, no raised voices, no violence to punctuate the moment, just clarity. The kind that reorders priorities permanently. When they stood to leave, Bumpy held the man's gaze one last time. Respect ain't loud, he sighed, but it's expensive when you fake it. The man nodded. Not submissive, corrected. Outside, Harlem felt the shift before it heard about it. That's how calm domination worked. No bodies, no headlines, just alignment. The balance restored without spectacle, and everyone understood. The shot hadn't failed. It had taught. Years later, nobody argued about who pulled the trigger. It didn't matter. What stayed with Harlem wasn't the gunman or the weapon or even the sound itself. It was what followed, and more importantly, what didn't. The driver never forgot that moment. The way the shot felt closer than danger. The way silence came after like a decision, not a shock. He would describe it the same way every time, voice low, careful. It wasn't the gun, he'd say. It was what Mr. Johnson did with it. The streets remembered too. They remembered that no storefront burned. No child learned a new fear that day. No reckless blood was spilled to satisfy pride. Life continued, not because it was weak, but because it was protected. Bumpy Johnson didn't give speeches about restraint. He didn't frame himself as a moral man. He just practiced something rare in his world. Control. The echo of that shot lived on, not as a threat, but as a reference point. A lesson passed quietly from one generation to the next. When someone asked how power really worked in Harlem, the answer never started with violence. It started with silence. Men learned that loyalty wasn't bought with fear alone. It was earned by consistency, by knowing when to stand still, by understanding that the community watched everything, even when it said nothing. Bumpy's authority outlived the moment because it wasn't built on reaction. It was built on memory, on the understanding that respect, once demonstrated, didn't need constant reinforcement. That's why the streets stayed steady. That's why people stood with him. The shot had been meant to provoke chaos, to force a public unraveling. Instead, it revealed a different kind of strength, one that didn't rush to be seen. Harlem carried that forward, quietly. And when men spoke of Bumpy Johnson later, they didn't talk about how loud he was or how fast he struck. They talked about a day when a gun went off at point-blank range, and the most powerful man in the room chose patience. That choice echoed longer than any bullet ever could.